Hey there, and welcome to the first video in this series, in which we're going to be creating a higher and lower guessing game in Python 3. This series is really aimed at those who are fairly new to Python, so perhaps you've got a grasp of things like variables, collection types, functions, loops, etc. And over the course of this series, we're going to be tying together a lot of the basic concepts of Python to give us a fairly well-written, simple higher and lower guessing game at the end here. If I just flick over to the code for a second, this is what you'll be creating. It's about 170 lines long. Of course, give or take a few spaces of things like comments and things like documentation strings inside our functions here. So what we'll do first is just show you a brief outline of what the game actually does. So if I can flick it here for a second. We follow 6 basic steps. So the first thing we're going to do is use the input function to ask the user to input their name. Then use user input again to ask them to effectively put in a low and a high point. So say, for example, if they choose 1 and 10, we then use 1 and 10 in step 4 to say, okay, make a random number between 1 and 10. So it just depends how difficult you want this to be here. So you can make it super easy or super difficult. So given that we have a random number between x and y, we're then going to create a main gameplay loop to basically ask the user to try and just guess what that number is. Of course, we're going to show this number, but effectively this loop's going to run and keep going until they get that guess correct. Once they do, we're then going to take the number of guesses they took, the low and the high points and their name, and then write that into a text file to keep a record of gameplay. So we're using quite a lot here. We're going to be using while loops, we're going to be using the random module, we're going to be writing to file, we're going to use some input validation here as well. So we're going to use a lot of the basic concepts of Python just to kind of put this whole game together. And of course, over the course of the series, we're going to be doing, I guess you could argue, it's a deep dive into many of these functions here to really explain what these functions are doing and why we're going to be using them. So to finish off this section, I want to show a quick run of the game actually going through. Of course, I'm using VS Code here as well, and I'll link this theme I'm using as well in case you want to use it in the description. So I hit run. The first thing we get is a prompt asking us for our name here. So I'm going to go ahead and write James. Next up, we're going to be asked for our lowest and highest number. So if I put 1 as the lowest, and let's say I do 10 as my highest, this now means that I'm asking for a random number between 1 and 10. So we get a little prompt saying that the random number's been established, and now we start the game. So this is now going to be our main game loop. So let's go and guess. Let's try 5. Okay, let's try 2. That was pretty good. We took 2 attempts to guess 2, and you may have noticed there that this scores.txt has now appeared. So if we examine this, all we're doing is adding a simple string, just saying player X took this many guesses, given a choice of 10 numbers. So for every time you play this game, it's going to be adding a new line to this file here. So the idea is that maybe you want to keep a record of all the games you've done. This will do it, and it will also add the date and time at the end, which is pretty neat. Just to highlight the different functions, we'll keep referring back to this as well. It's always a good idea in Python to effectively make your code as functional and as modular as possible, I would argue. So in this case here, we can effectively do the whole game in 6 functions. So each function has its own specific job. And this loosely ties into something called the single responsibility principle. And that basically means that a function or a class should have a single job, and that single job only. Okay? So imagine you have a function that does 4 or 5 things, and that function goes wrong. That can have implications elsewhere. So it's a really good idea just to make your functions simple, clean, make them do one job, and do that job well. It just makes debugging, and it makes extending your code later on a whole lot easier. Our code has 6 main functions, and I'll just briefly show you in this video, and in the next video we're going to be building these functions out, and of course at the very end of the series we'll have our fully working code. So our first 2, we have our main and main gameplay functions here, so let's go take a look at those. They have a very important job. The main function is effectively a driver function, so I'll blank that off for a second. And the job of this is it's called at the very beginning here. Now what it does, its job is to effectively call the other functions piece by piece. So if I flip back here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other functions, but the main function, its job is to orchestrate when these are called and in what order they are called. So it's like a driver. It's there, it's like the motherboard that links everything together in your computer. So you can see it setting up the lower upper numbers. We can see it establishing a random number, starting the main gameplay, and finally we can see it creating the save file text and then sticking that text into the text file at the end, thus creating this. So that's the main, that's the job of main here. We then have main gameplay. And the job of this is it's sort of similar. It doesn't call any other of our user-defined functions, but its job is to kind of just orchestrate that loop. So you notice it's the bulk of this function is a while loop. So its job is just to effectively keep the game going until you get it correct, and then once you get it correct, yeah, cool, it prints this and returns how many guesses you took. Next up, we have these two functions in this kind of different color green. And these two functions, these are called right at the beginning. So we have the retrieve lower upper numbers. So this is the bit where it asks you to input your lowest number and your highest number. So we can go take a look at that in here. It's probably actually more complex. There it is, here, retrieve lower upper numbers. So this uses a while loop as well. And what we do in this, of course, generally in Python, whenever you're dealing with user input, it can be quite risky because you're allowing people to enter data into your program. So, for example, we have a try and except here to catch situations where if the user enters something inappropriate, so of course, if they enter like 10 as in TEN, that's going to break this. So we want to catch that with an exception here. And also, what if they enter low and high the wrong way around? That's not going to be good. That's going to crash things elsewhere in the program. So we're going to try and deal with that here as well. So that's this function. Once that one's done, we then use the random module, which we've imported here, and we use that in a really simple context. We just say, take in a lowest, take in a highest, return a random number between lowest and highest. And of course, I've tried to split those out. You could do these arguably in the same function, but I like to be kind of clean and make it as nice and as simple as possible. That's why I've done it over two functions here. And the final two functions we're going to be looking at are these two. So we have one which is called create save file text, and the other is called write text to file. And these are fairly straightforward. One of them basically creates a big string with all of that data. So if I head back to our code and look at this, its job is just to create this. So if I just go and show that briefly, it's this one here. So it creates this sort of template string, and we use string.format, which we'll come to it when we look at this function. And all it does is just populates these gaps with their name, number of guesses, how big of a choice they had, and then it puts the date and time at the end here. So we're also going to be using the date time module for looking at this bit. And finally, once that one's done, that returns the string from this file, passes it to here, where this simply opens the file under a given mode, in this case append, which we'll come to later, and just writes it to file. In this case, just a quick heads up, whenever we're using append mode, it means we're effectively adding text to this rather than overwriting it every time. So this will just add a new line every time, which is pretty useful. And that's about it really. So over the course of the coming weeks, you can expect to be writing these 6 functions. And of course, for every function we do, we'll be discussing what these type hints do, why we add this, for example. We'll be looking at how to write correct documentation strings, how to make our code PEP 8 compliant, which is important if you're in the market for a job in Python. You'll need to be using PEP 8. And of course, all the code will be linked in the description, so if you want to go ahead and take this, make it your own, that's absolutely fine. And in the final video, what we'll be doing as well is discussing some points for improvement. Of course, this code could be extended greatly. You can make it into, for example, a 2-player game. We could read the scores at the start to show the user the last game played, for example. We could, there's loads of ways we could extend this. So in the last video, we'll talk about ways that you can make this code better. So if you're learning Python, I would suggest sticking around to the end of the series. And then these things here, these little points I've tried to suggest for improvement, these could be things which you could try and do by yourself to really try and boost your skills and make you a better Python programmer. Cheers for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a great day.